A mafia boss stopped for a starving woman selling her wedding ring for survival, then realized she was his dead brother's widow. Dante Morelli had spent years building an empire, believing power could protect blood. But the woman standing in the rain before him was proof that everything he built had done the opposite. Elena had lost her husband, her home, and nearly her life to the world Dante created. And now, face to face with the one woman who carried the truth he had buried for years, he was forced to confront the cost of his pride, his violence, and the legacy he called love. This was no longer just a story about crime, it was about what happens when power poisons a family so deeply that the only thing left to save is whatever can still be rebuilt from the ruins.
Observe this tableau, the sovereign of the underworld. Dante Morelli witnesses his brother's widow decaying upon a public walkway. She attempts to barter her matrimonial band for a trivial $20, oblivious to the predatory silhouette of a luxury vehicle idling beside her. Dante recognizes that medal. It is the very token he bestowed upon a brother he liquidated 6 years ago. Elena Whitmore was once the jewel of the elite, yet she now stands as a fractured relic, crushed by a meticulously dismantled existence. The remorse Dante thought he had entombed is resurfacing through the cracks of his composure. Stay with us as we dissect the fallout of this encounter. Tell us your location in the comments. A deluge consumes Brooklyn, transforming the asphalt into a series of somber obsidian mirrors. Dante remains insulated behind reinforced glass, his gaze fixed on the blurred world outside. He is a man of industry with kingdoms to manage and contracts to finalize before the clock strikes 12. A tactical error in navigation by Romano leads them into a wasteland where hope has long since withered. In the shadows of a shuttered storefront, Dante glimpses a figure trembling beneath a decaying awning. The atmosphere within the cabin shifts instantly. The climate control feels useless against the sudden internal chill. The woman is a skeletal apparition, a phantom draped in tattered remnants of a former life. Her damp hair clings to her skin like dark, weeping vines in the frigid downpour. She is fixated on a minuscule object in her palms, her extremities vibrating with such intensity they seem on the verge of fracturing. She offers a shimmering artifact to a passerby in a stained overcoat, her wedding ring. The stranger barely acknowledges her before vanishing into the urban mist. In that moment, her spirit undergoes a total structural failure. It is the ultimate intersection of loss and despair. Recognition finally pierces Dante's armor. He barks a command for Romano to halt immediately. Before the vehicle can fully settle, he is submerged in the torrential rain. His bespoke wool coat is ruined, but his focus is singular, the shivering specter huddled in the dark. He pauses 5 feet away, and as she lifts her gaze, the abyss looks back. Her eyes are recessed pits, outlined by the deep violet of chronic exhaustion. It is a haunting resurrection, for the woman before him is none other than Elena. He utters her name with a reverence that borders on a plea, but she senses no sanctuary, only terror. Upon recognizing his silhouette, she clutches her ring and attempts to flee, but her physical strength has long since evaporated. Pressed against the freezing masonry, her respiration comes in shallow, desperate gasps. Dante reaches out, but she recoils as if from a blade. This is not merely the effect of the winter, it is the resonance of profound trauma vibrating through her very marrow. He inquires about her descent, but his words carry no weight in this gutter. Her only rebuttal is a hollow, cynical laugh, the sound of an individual who buried her belief in salvation years ago. She is finished with pretenses. She indicts him for orchestrating her erasure years prior, a verbal strike that penetrates Dante deeper than any physical projectile. He stands motionless in the storm, a silent witness to his own cruelty. He questions the duration of her exile on these streets. She refuses eye contact, suppressing a scream of indignation. She eventually snarls that the time has been sufficient and declares with absolute clarity, his pity is an insult she will not entertain. She begins a slow, labored retreat into the gloom, her posture broken by the biting wind. Dante's internal logic, the code of the syndicate, battles with his conscience. He could simply allow the shadows to reclaim her. It would be the path of least resistance. "Please," he calls, the syllable sounding foreign and jagged in his throat. She halts, though she refuses to turn. When he asks how her world collapsed so entirely, he sounds uncharacteristically mortal. She finally glances back, her eyes brimming with a tidal wave of grief. She delivers the final verdict. He was the catalyst for her ruin. For 6 years, Dante has sheltered behind the fortress of his ego, but facing the wreckage of Elena Whitmore, those ideological walls begin to disintegrate into dust. He commands her to enter the vehicle, but a flicker of defiance remains. Though her body is a map of starvation, visible in every protruding bone, she refuses to move a single inch toward the man who dismantled her life. On the precipice of unconsciousness, she still weaponizes her tongue. She mocks his sudden impulse to play the benefactor. The irony is not lost on her. Dante cannot occupy the role of the savior when he was the architect of the tragedy. She asks if he truly comprehends the topography of hell. She lost her partner, her home, and her very essence because he deemed her expendable. Every accusation is a surgical incision, and Dante allows the wounds to open. He offers no excuses for the sins of his past. He simply repeats the command to enter the car. In this moment, he almost craves a physical blow, some tangible manifestation of her hatred to anchor him to reality. She demands to know the source of this sudden concern after years of calculated abandonment. Dante rejects the persona of the noble protector. He simply states that he finally sees her, and that image is now permanently etched into his psyche. Elena finally fractures. She gazes at the thin band of gold, the final vestige of her previous existence. She whispers that this ring was meant to purchase no more than 3 or 4 days of continued breath. The realization is a visceral blow. That band represented her husband's legacy, yet it was being appraised for a mere $20. The sheer scale of this tragedy defies any logical metric. He issues the decree, "Get in." She searches his expression for a hidden snare, then finally surrenders to the inevitable. She clarifies, however, that her presence in his car does not constitute an absolution for his crimes. Inside the sedan, the atmosphere is suffocating. She huddles against the door, maintaining the maximum possible distance. Dante respects the boundary, offering her the sanctuary of silence. As the climate control activates, her tremors actually intensify. Romano asks for a destination, and Dante observes the hollowed shell of the woman who once burned with such vitality, searching for any remnant of her former spirit. He recalls a woman of intellect and grace, the one his brother adored. Now she is a specter. When he announces they are returning to his residence, she descends into a state of acute panic. She pleads for any alternative, a shelter, a church, a cold doorway. She insists her degradation is hers alone to bear. But Dante has ceased all negotiations. Her destiny is now tethered to his, regardless of her consent. The resistance finally drains out of her. She leans her forehead against the glass and whispers a quiet, "I hate you." Dante doesn't flinch. He accepts the condemnation as a just debt. For 20 minutes, they traverse the city in a heavy, wordless vacuum. Elena watches the urban lights blur into streaks of neon, appearing more like a phantom than a person. Dante, meanwhile, is calculating the logistics of her preservation. They arrive at his imposing brownstone. Romano opens the door, but Elena remains frozen. Dante issues a low, authoritative command to disembark. She views the architecture as a gilded cage, but autonomy is a luxury she forfeited years ago. Tonight, she stays. Time stretches into an agonizing sequence until she finally exits, her legs nearly failing her on the cold stone. Dante escorts her into the silent, cavernous house. The only light is the amber glow of the lamps, casting long, unsettling shadows across the foyer. She stands, a puddle of rainwater forming on his polished hardwood. He gestures toward the guest suite and the bath, offering a comfort she never solicited. She stares into the void until she finally retreats into the darkness of the upper floor. She offers one final, lethal gaze before vanishing. Dante finally exhales, the weight of the evening pressing down on his chest like lead. He moves toward the kitchen, driven by a primal need for utility. He prepares a rudimentary meal: bread, cheese, poultry. He moves through his own mansion like a restless spirit, haunted by the woman he tried to erase from his memory. Elena is the one casualty he cannot justify. She is his own kin's widow, the woman he sacrificed at the altar of the organization. He maintained the fiction of necessity for 6 years, but those ignored pleas are now shouting in the silence. He knocks on her door, balancing a plate of food. Her response is a whisper from the grave. She is perched on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in a towel, her damp hair resembling weeping willows. She appears profoundly delicate in the dimness. When he presents the meal, she snaps that she has no appetite, a final act of defiance. He leaves the sustenance and indicates a wardrobe filled with garments she will likely never touch. Her feigned gratitude is as cold as the winter outside. When he attempts to close the distance, she rebuffs him with surgical precision. She identifies as a transient, merely waiting for the dawn to escape his golden confinement. He asks where she intends to flee, a question that leaves her momentarily paralyzed. Elena stares at the food, her pride engaged in a losing battle with her physiology. Consuming his bread feels like a sacrilegious act against her late husband. Eventually, biological imperative triumphs over her loathing. She devours the bread while fighting back tears. It is a 10-minute exercise in survival, leaving her alone with the memory of the man they both betrayed. Trembling beneath the covers, her mind drifts back to the funeral where Dante appeared as an untouchable deity. He never once acknowledged her presence from behind his wall of enforcers while she was consumed by her sorrow. His security detail treated her as a nuisance to be discarded. While he returned to his throne of power, she returned to a frigid flat and an avalanche of debt, watching her world dissolve with Marco's final breath. 6 years of calculated silence, and now he plays the philanthropist. She emits a jagged, bitter laugh while sinking into the high-end mattress. She wishes to flee, but the warmth is a trap, and the winter outside is a certainty of death. She drifts into a fitful sleep. But downstairs, Dante stares at a glass of vintage spirits he cannot stomach. He unlocks a concealed safe and retrieves a record of his own damnation. The entry from 6 years ago is concise. Marco is dead. The opposition exploited fraternal bonds, utilizing his brother as a mere instrument of leverage. Dante prioritized the syndicate's integrity over kin, remaining stoic while the assassins performed their grim mandate. He called their bluff, and Marco became the ultimate sacrifice to his siblings' unyielding hubris. The recollection of Marco's absolute devotion strikes Dante with the force of a lead projectile. He failed the singular soul who perceived him as a secular deity. He secures his ledgers, drains the whiskey in one draught, and seeks rest within a residence constructed from his own failures. Daybreak brings an atmosphere of profound displacement, the sensory echoes of the previous night, the rain, the discarded ring, the overwhelming remorse, resurface with agonizing clarity. Draped in his oversized garments, she feels like a counterfeit presence, bracing to confront the man she is ideologically bound to loathe. The manor remains as silent as a mausoleum. A brief note provides the promise of caffeine and continued refuge, yet he has already vanished. By leaving the entrances unfastened, he presents a psychological challenge, inviting her to flee a gilded prison defined by its own luxury. She stands at the threshold of liberation, but the scent of roasted beans and the sight of a ravaged garden paralyze her. There is a poetic symmetry in that decaying landscape. It serves as a physical manifestation of the internal devastation within her own spirit. It is essentially a botanical graveyard, suffocated by years of profound neglect. Yet beneath the aggressive overgrowth, she identifies the skeletal remains of a former beauty. Overgrown paths and architectural trellises merely waiting for a hand to acknowledge their existence with genuine care. She is immersed in the mire when his voice disrupts the stillness. He stands there in attire worth more than her entire history, observing her attempt to resuscitate the floral remains of his mother's legacy, a silent witness to her desperate labor. Her apologies meet a void of emotion. The garden perished alongside his mother 5 years ago, a casualty of the same emotional stasis that dismantled his own humanity. They remain two fractured entities standing amidst a field of uncultivated weeds and shared trauma. She demands a justification for his sudden act of benevolence. He finally meets her gaze, truly perceiving her, and admits to a moral debt that defies repayment. A few nights of hospitality cannot provide restitution for 6 years of calculated abandonment and systemic silence. He offers her sanctuary without conditions, but she ridicules the idea of becoming his latest redemptive project. She refuses to be the porcelain doll he repairs to alleviate his own conscience. He offers no rebuttal, standing before her in a state of absolute, uncharacteristic impotence. Penance. The word carries the density of lead. Recognizing the unadulterated torment in his eyes, her resentment begins to falter. She speaks with a quiet intensity, informing him that she is not the curative balm required for his own fractured and twisted soul. No apologies are offered, and no absolution is granted. They forge a pact within the soil. She will remain until the architecture becomes intolerable. He leaves her to the weeding, two specters inhabiting a grand structure that has finally regained a faint, rhythmic pulse. Unbeknownst to them, this scarred earth is the crucible where their buried secrets will surface. The initial week passes like a Gothic tale told in absolute silence. Elena navigates the corridors like a shadow, actively avoiding any encounter with the man who haunts her past. Dante remains a distant observer, never intruding upon her space or soliciting information. He departs before daybreak and returns after nightfall, ensuring she is nourished and the coffee remains hot. Their dialogue is restricted to the most clinical essentials, a dance of cold necessity. He notes the provisions, and she offers a frigid acknowledgement. He reminds her that the locks are under her control, that she is not his captive. Her gaze is as sharp as flint, confirming her understanding. By the 8th night, the psychological tension in the kitchen finally erupts. The air is saturated with the aroma of a sophisticated trattoria. She startles at his arrival, her posture suggesting a perceived transgression. She mumbles a nonchalant explanation regarding the pasta she prepared, then simply shrugs, attempting to mask her vulnerability with a mask of indifference. While not a formal cessation of hostilities, it represents a preliminary overture. Dante removes his necktie and sits, offering a quiet expression of thanks. She remains silent, manipulating the food with the mechanical precision of a creature attempting to remember the nuances of human interaction. Dante anticipates the mundane, but the meal is a revelation of culinary depth. The sauce possesses layers of ancestral history in every bite. When he describes it as extraordinary, Elena appears genuinely unsettled. She dismisses her craft as trivial, yet he identifies it as genuine artistry. She prepares to contest his praise until the weight of memory intervenes. She admits her mother was the source of her knowledge. Dante cataloged this detail, recognizing the depth of her hidden trauma. She softly confesses that her mother would have found beauty within these walls. Elena reflects that the garden would have been her mother's paradise, given her devotion to growth. Dante inquires if this is why she battles the soil. She admits the labor serves as a psychological anchor, a necessary diversion to prevent her mind from fracturing under the pressure. She questions if he is attempting to be her advocate. He maintains he is simply acknowledging the truth. A faint smile nearly touches her lips. She points out that the garden requires a miracle. The soil is contaminated, the timber is rotted, and the roses are essentially necrotic. Restoration would require an eternity and a vast fortune. Dante ceases his meal and instructs her to compile an inventory of every necessity. He will provide the capital. She attempts to reject his charity, but he asserts he is investing in the land's legacy, not her soul. She subjects him to a prolonged, analytical stare. Finally, she offers a sharp nod of acceptance. She will perform the labor alone, requiring no assistance. He vows to remain uninvolved. As they finish, the boundaries of their mutual hostility begin to dissolve into a complex silence. Elena attempts the cleaning, but Dante intervenes, assuming the domestic role since she performed the cooking. She seems disoriented by this shift in the power dynamic, a leader performing menial tasks. He simply begins scrubbing, his awareness constantly tracking her trajectory through the residence. Once the space is restored, he finds her transfixed by archival photographs in the hall. She focuses on the image of Marco's commencement, mourning the purity he possessed before the descent into violence. Dante stands beside her, contemplating the captured laughter of two brothers before their fall. In that era, their bond was absolute. At 22, Marco aspired to the legal profession, harboring a deep-seated resentment for the syndicate. Dante admits the catastrophic failure of that vision, eliciting a look of lethal condemnation from Elena that radiates across the quiet corridor. She demands to know why he persisted. Dante admits with chilling honesty that he coerced Marco into the organization. Desiring a brilliant strategist he could trust, he manipulated his own brother into the darkness. A profound betrayal of the fraternal bond and a psychological trap. Dante appears broken as he acknowledges his hubris was the architect of their ruin. Elena's fury is palpable. Marco's death was the price of Dante's ambition. She critiques his stoic facade at the funeral and the absence of remorse. He asks what words could possibly provide restitution. He confesses that the weight of regret is a daily burden, yet the dead cannot be recalled by words. She gestures at the mansion, labeling it a hollow sanctuary. Dante meets her gaze and states that her survival is the only fragment of humanity he has left. When she pushes for a definition of their status, he finally loses his composure. He hits her with the brutal reality. He witnessed her selling her wedding ring for $20 in the street. That moment shattered his delusion. He could no longer ignore her profound suffering. Seeing her at her lowest point altered his perspective. He seeks no absolution. He simply wants her to exist. He desires for her a life that is not defined by the graveyard. He is content to remain the villain in her narrative, provided she continues to breathe. He accepts his role as the antagonist in her personal history. Elena retreats into the silence of the upper floors. However, the following dawn reveals a comprehensive inventory of horticultural supplies on the counter. The woman is prepared to engage with the earth once more. Dante procures the items immediately. Within 48 hours, an extensive delivery of topsoil and professional equipment arrives. Elena observes the operation from her window with an analytical gaze, waiting for the site to be cleared before claiming her domain and beginning the work of restoration. That evening, she enters his study to offer a formal acknowledgement. When she speaks of financial reimbursement, Dante terminates the discussion. He asserts that money is irrelevant to their exchange. He has no interest in her meager funds, only in the fulfillment of his moral obligation. His singular fee is witnessing the resurrection of the landscape. Elena applies herself to the soil with primal intensity, dedicating every waking moment to the garden. She is reconstructing her reality 1 inch at a time, and she will not be deterred by the ghosts of her past. Dante returns to find her encrusted in soil, yet radiating a newfound vitality. She appears luminous in the lengthening shadows of the yard. At 9 o'clock in the evening, he presents her with hydration, attempting to encourage a brief moment of respite from her obsessive labor. She consumes the water, but refuses to stop. The garden is her solitary fortress of sanity within this architecture of violence. Dante understands the desperation. He inquires about her ultimate architectural vision for this renewed patch of earth, looking for a glimpse into her healing mind. She describes a landscape of tomatoes, herbs, and resilient roses, not fragile varieties, flowers capable of enduring the harshest winters. This botanical labor is the only thing preventing her descent into total psychological darkness, a living barrier between herself and the void. Dante joins her in the mire, questioning the significance of this work. Elena admits the garden is the only space where she holds sovereignty. Her history was a sequence of uncontrollable tragedies, but here she is the sole architect of life, controlling every seedling and thorn. She is the designer of this fledgling world, deciding what flourishes and what is discarded. Dante recognizes the trauma in her voice and urges her to claim this power. He tells her to build a reality that belongs entirely to her, free from the interference of men. This psychological recovery will span a lifetime. She clarifies her intentions. She is not planning to remain permanently. While Dante views this as a potential home, she remains firm. This is merely a temporary sanctuary, a pit stop on her path to total autonomy. Once her strength is restored, she intends to vanish into the unknown. Dante perceives this as aimless, but she labels it essential progress. She brushes the earth from her hands and reminds him she is not a project to be mended, departing before he can offer a rebuttal. Nevertheless, each morning she returns to the earth, planting with infinite patience. They exist in a strange gravitational lock, sharing meals and labor in absolute silence. Two enigmas at a single table, separated by a distance that no mansion, however grand, can bridge. Their dialogue remains a sterile performance of domesticity, mundane observations on the weather and the flora. Yet beneath this veneer of civility, a psychological tempest gathers, bound by architecture but severed by an infinite emotional distance. Eventually, she discovers the library, a sanctuary she ignored for months that now exerts an irresistible pull. Within, she finds a sprawling universe of literature and chronicle, a private cathedral concealed behind a single door. Retrieving a random spine, she encounters a chilling realization. Marco Morelli, inscribed in 2015. His signature haunts every leaf. This is no mere collection. It is the curated remains of a man's consciousness. Dante emerges from the gloom to explain that Marco traded his fortune for these pages. He held the conviction that an unlettered man was a hollow void. Elena weeps over the intellectual debris of the departed. She questions the preservation of this space. It was his essence, he replies. He could not discard the physical evidence of a brother's existence. For Dante, these volumes represent the final, tangible fragments of Marco's identity. Marco was a clandestine intellectual, a brilliant mind who performed the role of a brute to survive. Dante presents the keys to this realm as a peace offering, an olive branch bound in parchment and ink. He delivers a final, crushing epiphany. Marco's devotion to her was absolute. Elena's composure finally shatters. Bathed in light, she traces the lines he once studied, feeling his spectral presence inhabit the silence. To convalesce in the shadow of a fresh grave offers only a foul, suffocating ambiance. Departing her quarters, she finds Dante lingering over classical texts with a cynical smirk. Elena critiques his mechanical existence, a man merely decomposing while still drawing breath. While Dante seeks solace in whiskey, Elena deconstructs his reality with surgical precision. He maintains a facade of stability, yet she observes his slow descent into a psychological abyss. 16-hour labors serve merely as armor against his own internal haunting. She strips away his defensive layers, revealing a soul that has long since withered. A momentary connection ignites before she retreats, leaving him once more in his hollow state. At 2 a.m, he wanders the darkness until her presence provides a navigational light. Two fractured spirits find a fleeting, fragile equilibrium amidst the pervasive gloom. He offers a grim gratitude for her refusal to indulge his delusions. He skipped the funeral, but the hour of moral reckoning has finally arrived. He acted as a coward, retreating from the weight of his grief and transgressions. Elena's patience evaporates. She demands a full accounting of the hidden betrayals. In the cold calculus of power, Dante leveraged Marco's life for geographic dominance and lost. Blood vengeance failed to balance the ledger of his brother's unnecessary sacrifice. The revelation of betrayal poisons the very air Elena breathes within his presence. Truth acts as a blade. She flees the wreckage of the man she thought she knew. Elena adopts a spectral existence, appearing only to scavenge for basic sustenance. Through brief notes and silent chores, she remains a ghost, haunting the house's periphery. Dante finds himself consumed by the very book he should have consigned to the flames. He sacrificed Marco like a disposable pawn, yet the strategic gain was non-existent. A hollow greeting precedes his withdrawal. He is the man prepared to vanish into history. Elena observes his stagnation, condemning the willful blindness that led to their ruin. 6 years of deception revealed that Marco was merely a piece in a larger game. She rejects even his bread, while he confesses to a total spiritual vacuum. Offering no justifications, he permits her hatred to wash over him without resistance. He questions her continued presence, knowing her chains are now purely psychological. Elena remains anchored to him, though the logic of her stay eludes her own understanding. Shared misery becomes their only bond. He invites her into the depths of his drowning. She resents her reliance on him, yet the dialogue between their broken selves continues. Seeking no absolution, she demands only the map of the sins that destroyed their world. Dante grapples with internal specters, while Elena demands the unvarnished reality of their tragedy. She seeks no comfort, only the raw, clinical truth of the carnage. Gauging her fortitude, he finally acquiesces. Within his inner sanctum, he unlocks the vault and produces a leather-bound ledger, a comprehensive inventory of his moral bankruptcies. He reveals the passage concerning Marco, warning that the content will leave a permanent scar. As he slides the volume across the table, her hands tremble with visceral dread. The parchment is stained by history and regret. She commands him to stay, forcing him to witness her undoing. The narrative shifts from professional detachment to absolute, frenzied chaos. The penmanship devolves into a jagged, frantic scrawl. Vittorio's hounds executed a surgical abduction. Within 2 hours, the ransom arrived. Surrender the waterfront, betray 3 associates, and deliver $2 million. He had 72 hours to choose. His subordinates pleaded for the ransom, valuing kinship over commerce. Yet Dante viewed the world as a board. He feared a single concession would trigger a total collapse. He initiates a high-stakes psychological maneuver, adopting an icy persona to force leverage. It appears to be a masterful strategic play. Yet by day 2, Marco has vanished, and the architect of this scheme begins to crumble. The 72nd hour arrives. He attempts a dialogue, but the connection is severed. With 6 hours remaining, he is hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. He fears that any visible vulnerability signals their collective extinction. Then, the silence finally shatters. The unfolding sequence is a profound tragedy. Marco is discarded at the pier like a derelict object, his features erased. The medical findings reveal a cruel paradox. He perished on day 2, rendering the entire negotiation a hollow charade. The true devastation lies in his lingering culpability. He prioritized the crown over his own blood, and his brother paid the ultimate toll. Elena is fracturing. He maintained a fabrication for years, knowing the reality would annihilate her spirit. He remained incapable of meeting her gaze during the rites. He attempted to alleviate his conscience with wealth, but she refused the currency of his guilt. Consequently, he embraced his shadow, systematically purging Vittorio's entire lineage from existence. 3 months later, Vittorio's legacy is reduced to embers. He incinerated the opposition, yet the victory yielded nothing. Retribution cannot resurrect the fallen. Elena closes the chronicle, her heart weighed down by the density of lead. Her hands tremble with involuntary spasms. He sits with the stillness of a monument while her reality is dismantled. They intended his death regardless, she murmurs. He merely offers a quiet admission of his role. Truly, I cannot discern if that is an objective truth or a necessary fiction for survival. He regards her with an unblinking stare. I will never ascertain if more capital could have secured him. I simply endure my choices. I consigned him to the executioner's block. Elena is a vessel of internal combustion. She expresses her profound loathing, and he offers no defense. Yet she perceives a release. The agonizing uncertainty has finally reached its conclusion. The oppressive shadow has ceased its consumption of her. He makes no attempt at self-justification. Then she poses the quintessential question regarding his affection. He confesses his ego convinced him he could manipulate fate itself. That revelation is an utter failure of character. Elena paces like a caged predator. Acknowledging a fatal error does not resurrect the casualty. She falters, her voice tightening. He inquires about the nature of her comparison. The nature of actually caring. Her voice reaches a crescendo. He remains unnervingly composed, as if analyzing a failed corporate acquisition. She craves his aggression, a catalyst to fuel her ongoing resentment toward him. She seeks a conflagration, not this sterile resignation. At that moment, his composure finally disintegrates. The facade shatters. He is consumed by self-loathing and a desperate daily yearning to reverse the irreversible. His brother's specter haunts his every vision. He recognizes his own folly in bartering blood for enterprise. His voice finally falters. He decimated his world through pure arrogance. Is this the confession you required? It is. The atmosphere is suffocatingly dense. Elena declares her inability to reside within the home of the architect of her husband's demise. He acknowledges this, yet she notes his profound lack of true comprehension. She is not yet prepared to depart as a fugitive. She seeks a moment of stillness within the sanctuary of the library. She must reconstruct her identity. When she eventually exits, it will be by choice, not coercion. She is forging a distinct path. He offers a hollow acceptance, which triggers her fury. She desires him to exhibit any emotion, mockery or desperation, rather than this detached stoicism. Yet he insists the agency is entirely hers. The decision remains her own. He forfeited his influence over her destiny when he fabricated the narrative regarding Marco. He refuses to dictate her life again. He exists now only as a hollowed remnant. This is not absolution, but a preliminary step. He is finally attempting to reconcile his moral insolvency. She whispers her intent to retire for the night. He watches her depart. She acknowledges his candor. He affirms her right to it. She leaves him submerged in shadow with the testament of his failures. By morning, the atmosphere has shifted. The obscurity has lifted. She discovers the patriarch in the kitchen, struggling ineffectually with a simple meal. "You risk incinerating the residence," she observes. He recoils, visibly startled by her presence. He assumed she was still absent. She assumes control of the task, and he admits his profound incompetence in the domestic arts. His sole intent was to ensure her sustenance. She is visibly moved by this uncharacteristic gesture. A subtle smile emerges amidst the wreckage of their history. She requests the salt, and they find a quiet, mutual cadence. Observe this transition. The hostility has evaporated. They are sharing a meal in unprecedented tranquility. She decides to cultivate the garden, and the Don offers his assistance. Remarkably, she accepts his proposal. Her body is burdened by fatigue, so the patriarch pledges to discard his formal attire and assist her. Seeing this sovereign of the underworld in casual clothing is a surreal sight. He is finally making physical contact with the earth. She commands him to labor, demanding he excavate 12 inches as if concealing a casualty, though the purpose is life. They are finding a strange harmony in the soil. There is no conflict, only labor under the fading light. They are marked by the earth, resting on the threshold. She expresses gratitude for his momentary humanity. He remarks on the low standard of her expectations. She is finally dismantling her psychological defenses. The conversation turns to gravity. He inquires about her descent into poverty following the tragedy. She reveals it was not a singular catastrophe, but 1,000 small fires that consumed her existence. It was a recursive descent. Employment vanished, housing became untenable, and the inheritance was sequestered by criminal associations. The family treated her as a malignant presence, a scapegoat for their own sins. They excised her like a growth. She moved between temporary shelters until her social capital was exhausted. The paradox of survival. One requires stability to build a life, yet a life to find stability. She simply dissipated. All optimism was extinguished. He is laden with remorse, but she does not grant him easy absolution. 6 years of suffering are not easily erased, yet they have clarified the past before seeking rest. The subsequent weeks carry a novel energy. Each evening is spent transforming a barren plot into an aesthetic triumph. She is the architect, and he provides the physical force. Synergy yields a new reality. While he attends to his empire, she reclaims her agency. She traverses the metropolis, observing its rhythms like a stranger in a familiar land. Our protagonist is finally rediscovering her own equilibrium. She returns with diagrams for future cultivation. We see plans for seasonal cycles and winter preservation. He recognizes the implication. She is looking toward the future. Does this signify her permanent residence? He probes for certainty, but she maintains her mystery. She has made no definitive commitment, yet her actions suggest belonging. He is developing genuine affection and harbors a silent wish for her continued presence. A nocturnal crisis of the soul. Neither can find repose. She discovers him buried in ledgers long after midnight. Both are haunted by the echoes of history, waiting for the clock to strike. She asks if he mourns his chosen path. He confesses a profound hatred for his lifestyle every single day. Yet he is trapped. He lacks the knowledge of how to exist as anything other than a predator. A tragic revelation. He was a mere 19 when the crown was forced upon him. He had no agency. Yet Marco shared a confidence. The Don was once an artist. He is visibly shaken by the memory. His brother betrayed his secret passion for urban landscapes. 2 decades have passed since he held a charcoal. She urges him to stop merely existing and begin the arduous process of truly living. He is transfixed by her insight. She credits her months of isolation for this wisdom. Her motivation is not for his sake, but to prevent the poison of resentment from consuming her own soul. The following day, he acquires materials and begins creating in the late hours. She observes him through the doorway, witnessing the liberation of his suppressed artistic spirit, a true evolution of self. She leaves him to his work, offering only a silent smile. It is not a panacea for their trauma, but a significant progression. They are learning to coexist with their history without destroying their future. Resentment and serenity have finally reached a truce. When the blossoms emerge in spring, she tends to them with a ritualistic devotion. They have invested weeks in preparing the ground for this rebirth. He sits on the veranda, sketching while she performs the labor. He claims to be merely an observer, citing his inability to foster growth. She responds with a rare, genuine expression of amusement. A functional symmetry has emerged. She provides the intellect, he the power. She recounts her mother's warning that roses are spiteful and will perish just to spite their caretaker. Is that not familiar? He jests that her temperament matches the flowers. Her laughter is vibrant. Marco always insisted she was the most resilient and unyielding spirit he had ever known, especially in the wake of conflict. Correctness isn't victory, Elena asserts, a flash of her former spirit. Watching his brother's muse reawaken, Dante feels the calcified armor of his own sorrow begin to fracture and fall away. Elena is ensnared by curiosity, demanding the narrative Marco once wove. Dante descends into his archives, retrieving fragments of the woman who once served as his brother's beautiful ruin. Marco's testimonials were surprisingly mundane, her inability to multitask or her tears during cinema. Yet, as she tends the soil, a faint, genuine smile betrays her feigned indignation regarding the dog film. He characterized her as a domestic fury with a divine touch in the kitchen, humming melodies she never consciously recognized. When she inquires about the tune, Marco's own confusion mirrors her forgotten past. It was a maternal echo, a lullaby stripped of words but saturated with intent. Dante permits the silence to settle as they plant 6 saplings, a fleeting truce in a life of war. While Elena views the flora as doomed, Dante adopts the role of quiet visionary. Discussing next year's bloom is a radical act of hope within a lineage defined by sudden endings. Under the cover of night, Elena unearths a hidden chronicle tucked behind legal volumes. This isn't a ledger of crime, but the visceral, bleeding architecture of Marco's internal world. Prostrate on the floor, she devours the text like a lifeline. It maps his transition from familial obligation to the singular, transformative moment he encountered his destiny. He witnessed her at a gallery, a vibrant specter in crimson, dismantling a pretender's ego with surgical precision. Marco was instantly captivated, a man lost before he even knew her name. After 3 desperate pilgrimages to that temple of art, his charade was transparent. Yet the true shadow loomed, not in the gallery, but in the inevitable judgment of his brother, Dante. Following a grueling minute of silent appraisal, Dante offered a rare benediction. She was a prize he didn't deserve to tarnish. Elena finds herself suspended between tears and bittersweet laughter. The narrative then darkens into coercion. Dante framed Marco's involvement as a necessary bridge to a legitimate future, despite Marco's agonizing realization that this path would poison his love. Marco eventually surrendered to the machine. Elena's response wasn't a scream, but a chilling silence. Despite his internal fraying, Dante convinced him that he alone could fix their broken dynasty. It was a sophisticated deception. Dante's promises were hollow, and the business proved an insatiable beast. Marco chose to stay, drowning in loyalty rather than abandoning his brother to the depths. 3 days before the end, the atmosphere turned spectral. Dante urged seclusion, but Marco reclaimed his agency for a single night, refusing to fail his beloved yet again. A solitary dinner became a fatal altar. Elena is haunted by the irony that he walked into an executioner's trap simply to grant her the illusion of a normal life. She realizes Marco wasn't a mere casualty of circumstance. He was a collaborator in his own tragedy, choosing the weight of a crown and his brother over the safety of the shore. Dante discovers her with the journal, his composure shattering like glass. The revelation of his own cruelty, reflected in his brother's words, becomes an unbearable mirror of his failures. Elena remains an empty vessel as Dante confesses his manipulation. He had pleaded for Marco's presence daily, transforming fraternal love into a psychological prison of perpetual debt. Dante admits to weaving a web of lies to maintain proximity. However, Elena rejects the victim narrative. She asserts that Marco chose his own chains, regardless of the favor asked. She assumes a frigid, analytical distance. Marco was an adult responsible for his own wreckage. Dante is unnerved, finding no sanctuary in the blame she refuses to give him. Hating a villain was a simple binary. This nuanced truth is far more exhausting. She sought a monster to pay her emotional debt, but found only a messy, gray reality. She confronts him with the brutal truth. Marco invited the dark. He ignored the sirens of danger for a final meal. Dante built the cage, but Marco turned the bolt. One cannot harbor hatred for the autonomy of the dead. Dante searches for absolution from his guilt, but finds only two fractured souls amidst the ruins of their shared dreams. Dante retrieves the diary, a ghost of a laugh escaping him. Marco visited the gallery 4 times, a detail Dante knows because he funded the transit for each desperate attempt. Marco viewed abstract art as mere expensive geometry. Elena is overcome. She always recognized his facial tells, the subtle twitch that signaled he was performing for her affection. They begin to coalesce, stitching together the silhouette of the man they both adored. The toxicity of their rivalry dissolves, replaced by a profound, unwanted tether of shared mourning. She questions if Marco would approve of this alliance. Dante suggests Marco only desired her sanctuary, even if that safety required a pact with the devil himself. The departure of rage leaves a vacuum of terrifying hope. Elena abandons the book, fleeing into the night to escape the suffocating weight of this new understanding. In the garden, she seeks the logic of the earth while the world collapses. Dante follows like an inescapable penance, offering an apology that carries the gravity of their entire history. "I am fine," she lies, focused on the thorns. She confesses she once spent hours choreographing his demise, a mental exercise in vengeance that has now lost its utility. Her grand scripts of retribution have evaporated into exhaustion. She admits she is simply tired of the labor required to stay angry. Dante suggests she finally set the burden down. Yet identity is often forged into fires of resentment. Without her rage, she is a stranger to herself. Dante offers his hand, a proposal of synergy against the encroaching dark. She searches for the hidden hook, but finds only a man stripping away his own pretenses. She accepts the truce, not as a fairy tale, but as a functional beginning. Weeks later, a domestic rhythm emerges from the chaos. Between communal meals and the soil, Elena begins to inhabit his office, sketching a sanctuary while he manages the books. He reveals a blueprint for a total botanical transformation, a sanctuary born of architectural precision. Elena views it as an act of faith, a concept Dante equates with hope. He declares his intent to dismantle the criminal apparatus and emerge into the light. Elena is cynical. 20 years of managing a machine of violence is a difficult stain to erase. He confesses that villainy was merely the path of least resistance. He is weary of the blood and the constant threat of total erasure, seeking a life beyond mere survival. She is the catalyst for this metamorphosis, a living reminder of a path not taken. He seeks to build a legacy that wouldn't cause Marco to avert his eyes in shame. The journal proved Marco's love was unconditional, even amidst the nightmare. Elena encourages his pivot. Failure is a risk, but stagnation is a certainty he must finally overcome. He requests her presence to navigate the transition, a gardener guiding a wolf. It is an unlikely pairing, but his vulnerability tethers her to his side, preventing his descent. She agrees, but under the condition of absolute transparency. The following dawn, the Shadow Empire is laid bare, every illicit contract and secret lever of power exposed for her audit. Elena becomes a relentless inquisitor in his boardrooms, dismantling shell companies and tax evasions. Dante watches with a perverse pride as she deconstructs the foundations of his former life. She is a force of nature, dismissing his lawyer's anxieties with a wave. To her, their sophisticated schemes are merely criminal acts wearing expensive tailoring, deserving no quarter or mercy. His arguments fail against the weight of her logic. It is a perilous trek through a legal minefield, but the old life is slowly sacrificed to allow a new reality to germinate. Elena acts as the stabilizing force, preventing his surrender to the abyss. Months later, as sunset ignites the garden, their shared labor yields a hallowed sanctuary. She marvels at their success, but he deflects the triumph. She insists on a true partnership. He simply smiles, acknowledging her quiet authority over their path. Within a serene lull, she reveals her impending departure. Dread consumes him instantly. She is finally prepared to pen an independent narrative, leaving his world behind. She secures a modest park slope flat to pursue a quiet vocation. Her escape is funded by frugality with his allowance. He is bitter, yet her resolve is absolute. The conclusion is final. Dante mourns their lost future, his voice broken by the realization that her logic is an unassailable fortress against his desires. Their haven was merely an intermission. She departs in 14 days, following the autumn sowing. Their physical chemistry lingers, though she promises not to vanish entirely. Sovereignty demands she refuse his illicit wealth to prove her own strength. They observe the twilight of their era, neither brave enough to name the grief. 2 weeks vanish into labor. He insists on professional logistics for her meager belongings. Elena finds his overbearing protection excessive, even as a parting gesture. He pleads for one final act of service. Her new 4-story walk-up is bathed in light, offering a fragile promise of rebirth and spiritual autonomy. She finds solace in the silence once the movers depart. Gratitude replaces fear as she credits him with helping her reclaim her soul and footing. Dante rejects the praise, viewing himself merely as the provider of the cage she outgrew. He honors her fortitude in surviving the abyss and rebuilding. She questions his sudden vulnerability. He seeks to fortify her spirit for the journey ahead. A sincere embrace precedes her final command to guard the roses. With a tearful smirk, she departs. Dante flees the intimacy, returning to a sprawling, hollow monument of power. He watches the garden, finally feeling her absence. Her employment at second chapter was almost too symbolic. Her mentor ignores the suspicious resume gaps, offering a fresh start and a simple canvas apron. Manual labor provides a necessary purgatory. Organizing literature and managing patrons allows her to finally earn a wage that feels sacred, untainted, and entirely hers. Physical exhaustion replaces psychic trauma, yet the silence of her flat is deafening. She yearns for the familiar echoes of his presence amidst the city's wail. She cultivates a lie of total independence, almost believing it until the phone vibrates. Dante's name evokes a visceral reaction. His voice reports a floral tragedy. Panic overrides her resolve. He claims ignorance while the flora withers under his clumsy stewardship. The master of men is defeated by simple garden soil. Frustration masks her underlying affection. She agrees to intervene after her shift, convincing herself she is saving the plants, not rescuing the man she left. Returning to his domain feels like a temporal rift. She knocks, finding him unraveled, a portrait of a man coming apart at the seams without her. The architect of order is now surrounded by chaos. He is visibly humbled as she critiques his disheveled state and the wreckage of his former sanctuary. He admits to the pressure. In the garden, she diagnoses his fatal error, suffocating care. He has inadvertently drowned the life he tried so hard to sustain. She exposes the anaerobic swamp he created. Dante kneels, mourning his unintentional destruction. She suggests a collaborative pruning, re-entering his orbit through shared, dirt-stained labor. Muscle memory guides them back into a familiar hierarchy. He submits to her expertise, though the surrounding decay reveals the extent of his internal neglect. He confesses his utter incompetence in her absence. When she mentions the delayed autumn planting, his voice falters. The garden was always just a metaphor for us. The subtext is heavy with unvoiced longing. Dante is a broken titan on the garden steps, his hands stained with the earth he cannot master alone. His empire is a collapsing star. Every attempt at reform triggers a new crisis. He is destroying his history for an uncertain, virtuous future she inspired. She questions his motivation. He cites his promise to her, but she warns that a change rooted in external obligation will only breed eventual resentment. His resolve hardens into steel. He chooses potential failure as a righteous man over the hollow safety of his former blood-stained life and moral decay. Her heart aches at his confession. She reassures him of Marco's pride, that love transcended the violent life they were once forced to lead together. She whispers of Marco's faith in his redemption. Her playful teasing masks a deep reverence for his struggle to finally emerge from the long shadows. A rare smile breaks his facade. The old friction softens into a shared warmth. They acknowledge the mutual void their separation created in their souls. Her autonomy requires this distance. She takes pride in her self-made life, promising only to return as a guardian of the garden's fragile, growing life. The ritual begins. Weekly maintenance serves as a bridge between worlds. They exchange fragments of their disparate realities while kneeling together in the dark soil. He shares the cold mechanics of power. She recounts the whimsical demands of the book trade. They find humor in the collision of their universes. They laugh at the absurdity of literary quests for feline time travelers. Their parallel lives intersect briefly amidst the thorns, a fragile and unspoken truce. This equilibrium feels sustainable until the silence is shattered. 2 months later, his call signals a new catastrophe that threatens their carefully cultivated, quiet peace. "Why require your presence?" he whispered, his vocal cadence devoid of its usual defensive plating. Elena retreated from the counter, her pulse a frantic percussion. He confessed that his foundations were crumbling, pleading for her presence at the bureau. That unvarnished, fractured resonance compelled her toward the arriving locomotive. Elena's cardiovascular system raced under the weight of a perceived eulogy. In a narrative reversal, the patriarch remains among the living, merely unspooling within his brownstone sanctuary. He reveals a devastating truth. An anonymous purchaser intends to dissolve his entire criminal hegemony. Every asset must be purged. Every illicit coin and blood-marred hectare. Elena wonders if this isn't the ultimate liberation, yet Dante has reached a psychological impasse. Holding the scepter since age 19, he now dreads the prospect of being an inconsequential specter in a landscape void of tactical strikes and grand thefts. Divested of the syndicate, his self-conception vanishes. Elena confronts him directly, asserting that the sovereign's circlet was merely cold iron and it is time for the internal man to emerge. Dante is a stranger to his own humanity, so she suggests it is far past time for a formal introduction. He ruminates on the silence of domesticity, fearing he will mourn the loss of structural entropy. Elena offers no platitudes. Cease testing the waters. One must either submerge into civilian existence or perish with the foundering vessel of the underworld, but the liminal space of indecision is a slow drowning. The temporal limit is Friday, 72 hours to dismantle a dynasty. Dante seeks egress but trembles at the prospect of life's mute button. Elena dismisses his trepidation. She has observed his spiritual reconfiguration for a year and recognizes that his essence will persist without the roar of violence. The pitiless commander has fundamentally transitioned into a man chasing absolution. He approaches, nearly imploring her to traverse this purgatorial transition by his side. He acknowledges he possesses no moral claim to her future, yet he craves a human ballast. Elena yearns for her autonomy, yet witnessing the architect of terror trembling and divested of his defenses is haunting. She cannot simply abandon such a profound psychic unraveling. She remains a captive of her own compassion for a predator struggling to endure the quiet. She acquiesces, but only until the signature is finalized. What follows is a 72-hour siege of legal strategy. She stands sentinel alongside the counselors to ensure his financial departure is impenetrable and his retreat from power is absolute. She encourages him to pursue the architectural path he desired before the twin gods of blood and capital intervened. He argues that 43 is an age too advanced for academia, but Elena is relentless. You are a man in his prime, not a relic. Explore the world. Then the conversation shifts toward shared itineraries. Elena maintains a tactical detachment, yet internally, she is enticed via the prospect of a pilgrimage unburdened by ghosts. No pacts of blood, merely the ember of genuine intimacy. The day of reckoning arrives. Friday. He executes the documents, effectively incinerating the realm he spent 20 years fortifying. He emerges from the office appearing like an apparition in the daylight, with Elena waiting within the penumbra to receive him. She abandoned her daily routine to witness Dante's leap into the ontological void. He experiences a profound sensory anesthesia, questioning the normalcy of his state. Elena retorts with dry wit. She doesn't typically witness the erasure of empires before the midday meal. The atmospheric pressure finally relents, and he offers a hollow chuckle. He is a billionaire without a destination. Elena clasps his hand, simplifying the equation. What is your visceral craving? The restoration begins with the most basic of needs. He desires only their sanctuary. He trades the $3,000 tailoring for weathered denim, and they simply occupy the soil, reclaiming their tranquility as the sun sets over the skeletal remains of his former dominion. He confesses his terror but admits to feeling as though a tectonic weight has been lifted. He finally stands with renewed stature, asking for her permanent companionship. Elena knows she should flee toward the horizon, yet she falters. She ought to have fortified her heart, yet within that revived sanctuary, she finally acknowledges her permanence. I shall remain, she murmurs. But the path to a peaceful life is a jagged, unforgiving trajectory for a man born of the hunt. He channels his internal agitation into the earth with a frantic intensity, reshaping the garden as if it were a tactical theater. Elena must intervene, reminding him that cultivation is not a combat exercise. She urges him to perceive New York through the eyes of a wanderer. Find a pursuit, she advises. He remains cynical until he enrolls in an artistic workshop to cease his obsessive rumination. In a twist of fate, the former enforcer possesses the soul of an artist. Elena mocks him until she witnesses the genuine brilliance on the canvas. Marco spoke the truth. His renderings of the metropolis are searing, capturing the urban pulse with authentic depth. Elena is stunned, yet Dante remains modest. The hardened exterior finally yields to a smile that is entirely unforced. The instructor mandates a public exhibition. Elena brings her literary colleagues to witness the former Titan's soul exposed. Seeing him stripped of his lethal persona and utterly vulnerable creates a poignant ache within her chest. She finds herself enamored with the creator rather than the destroyer, embracing every fractured element of his history. 6 months after abdicating the throne, the heavens fracture over Brooklyn. It is a cinematic downpour. Elena seeks shelter, but Dante remains stationary, absorbing the rain like a tragic protagonist. He is experiencing a celestial purification, allowing the deluge to scrub away the final traces of his criminal stain while she observes from the safety of the forge. Elena joins him in the torrent because logic has failed. They stand together like drenched, absurd creatures, yet it is the most authentic moment of their existence. It is the only place they truly belong. Then he reveals his deepest affection. He had attempted to maintain a professional distance out of respect for her departed spouse, but the storm shattered his internal barriers. He loves her for her resilience, even while believing himself unworthy of such mercy. He acknowledges his past is a ruin and seeks no forgiveness, merely offering the truth. Elena is paralyzed, the rainfall masking her sorrow. A year prior, this confession would have felt like a desecration of a sacred memory. Reason dictates escape, but her heart whispers of arrival. She should have retreated, but instead she silences his doubts with a rain-drenched kiss. It is a violent intersection of mourning and longing, and it is undeniably profound. Elena realizes their past is now entirely atomized. That single embrace transformed their trajectory, validating her humanity. She builds tomorrow on a fractured history. They improvise over warm tea and embers. Elena insists on agency despite their wreckage. They seek intimacy without the syndicate's shadow. Restoration is brutal, but the peace is earned. 1 year later, Dante reveals his legacy. He creates a sanctuary for the forgotten for Marco. Elena commits fully to his reconstructive mission. In Brooklyn, they restore worth to the discarded. Elena finally finds home in their cultivated Eden. She recounts a tragic tale from the streets. Elena admits she nearly became a nameless casualty. Their foundation finally eliminates the factor of luck. 2 years later, their mission expands rapidly. Dante presents a silver key, not a ring, profound. The key signifies home, not a replacement. Devotion persists while his crimes remain eternally etched. Daily, she validates the architecture of his redemption. Public splendor serves to veil their fractured internal world. Grasping that talisman, she discovers a fortified internal peace. That traumatic echo subsides into a faint, rhythmic static. Navigating the fallout, they pursue a unified conclusion. Dwelling in residue, no mystical cure offers salvation. Vowing to evolve alongside each newly breaking dawn,